Do you know what? I was super ready to change to Linux. I was one Microsoft OneDrive pop-up away from becoming a Linux separatist and changing my name to Linus. No, the other one. But once I offered up my body to Linux, my pale flesh quivering with anticipation, it didn't take long into our whole dance for it to become clear that Linux wasn't quite ready for me. It licked all of the wrong things, and it just didn't pseudo-apt get me going in any way. So in today's video, we're going to talk about why my switch to Linux failed and why it's generally just quite difficult to switch operating systems. But before we get into that, today's video is sponsored by Micro Center, and good news! The Phoenix Micro Center is finally opening on November 7th. So if you live in the area, go check it out for some hella grand opening sales. Also, Micro Center is having a bunch of amazing sales throughout the month of November, so check out the website regularly to stay on top of all of the deals. And then finally, congratulations to Micro Center for winning big in this year's PC Mag's Reader Choice Awards. So do some award-winning Micro Center shopping using the links down below. Now, there are a lot of reasons why you might want to switch operating systems. One of the big reasons recently is with the planned obsolescence of Windows 10. Basically, any PC more than like 7 years old became e-waste overnight. Windows 11 needs your system to support the TPM 2.0 security standard, which was launched back in 2015 and isn't supported by systems as recent as 1st gen Ryzen. Although that's just validated support according to Microsoft, in practice most 1st gen Ryzen systems should still support Windows 11, but still, for a huge amount of systems, unless you want Hackerman coming for your bathroom selfies, you kinda have to switch to Linux. But it's not just straight up obsolescence. Windows 11 is quite a bloated operating system, so it has a pretty heavy performance toll on weaker hardware. So if you're living with a potato, you might want to switch to Linux so that your operating system doesn't take up as much of your system resources. I also made a community post asking what made people unhappy enough with Windows to drive them into the arms of a new lover. And some of the main grievances cited was Microsoft shoehorning in AI crap and its insistence on forcing online features. I definitely recommend checking out that post to see what the community has to say about this, and also subscribe on the way down. But my main issue with Windows 11, aside from some instability issues, although honestly it's not really that bad, I actually have a bigger issue with how it handles external audio hardware. Just Google anything to do with ASIO drivers and then you'll immediately know what I'm talking about, but it's a huge pain in the ass. However, those two reasons are kind of side quests. The main issue for me is Windows and how it handles privacy issues. Like a bunch of you said in the community post, Microsoft keeps making it harder for you to use Windows without an online account, and that combined with the huge amount of telemetry that Windows 11 collects out of the box, and the privacy nightmare that is recall, just triggers that bit of my brain that was raised on the UFO files. Now granted, there are still pretty easy workarounds to this. Like if you make a Windows 11 install using software called Rufus, you can get around a lot of this. And even in privacy settings in your Windows 11 operating system, you can turn off a lot of the telemetry and a bunch of advertiser IDs and stuff. So, you know, in all fairness to Microsoft, they do give you access to a whole bunch of these features that you can turn off manually. Now going further here, and it's going to become pretty tinfoil hatty pretty quickly, but one of the main things that turned me off Microsoft was when last year they announced a partnership with Palantir. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop myself here because I went on an unhinged rant about how Palantir with Peter Thiel, the moist Bond villain, is just gonna take my data and like baby seals and then feed it into a big clubbing machine until it somehow spits out Skynet. I don't know. Ancient aliens did a real number on me. But that's all obviously way too ridiculous for me to say, so I won't say it. And it turns out after some research that Microsoft isn't actually selling data to Palantir, they're just giving them the compute infrastructure to do all of the things that I said that they're not doing. Wait. What was I talking about? Oh, Linux! So basically, one of my main reasons why I wanted to try Linux was I wanted a more privacy-focused operating system, which I get is a little bit redundant. It's kind of like being real insistent on getting a tetanus shot when you've already had both your legs blown off. Like, all my data is everywhere already, and whoever wants it can just pay for it. Like, it's not like this does anything, but let me at least feel principled, okay? So, did Linux solve my privacy concerns? Well, despite Linux being open source, it's kinda complicated. It depends a lot on the distro that you're using, and some distros, including the one I spent most of my time using, Bazzite, does have some basic telemetry enabled out of the box, which if that bothers you, you have to disable just like with Windows. But according to privacyguides.org, the main issue with Linux is security-based. Again, it depends on what distro you're using, but Linux isn't as secure from hackerman intrusions as an operating system like macOS. But despite these caveats, as privacyguides.org says, desktop Linux distributions are still a great option. And if you want to spelunk real deep into the privacy rabbit hole, you can use distros like Wunix or Tails. So in other words, if you know what you're doing, Linux gives you options. Although that does require you to know what you're doing. Although in all fairness, to a lesser degree, so does Windows, although that still has the real tech oligarchy issue. And aside from that, when it comes to a bunch of other concerns that I mentioned, like the whole obsolescence thing, Linux is kinda your only other option. So why did my Switch fail? Now, in order to understand why my Linux experiment didn't work, first we need to understand what I was trying to do with it, because that context is pretty important. For a month, I replaced Windows 11 on my at-home desktop system, which I primarily use for gaming, thumbnail making, and the occasional bit of video editing. And then finally, before we get into the rant, there is one important thing to understand about me as a computer user. The moment that software doesn't work exactly the way that I expect it to work, something snaps in my brain and a gorilla comes out that just wants to smash the device that I'm using. Which is part of the reason why I decided to go with the Linux distro, Bazzite. It's meant to be a very beginner-friendly Linux distro aimed squarely at gaming. You're supposed to just be able to download the ISO, install it on your system, and then do Steam gaming with it. Which is mostly the case. I was pleasantly surprised at how straightforward the setup process was. However, there are a lot of limitations which you mostly figure out by just trying to do a thing which usually just works on Windows and then have it not be supported and then be enraged. One of the most well-documented examples of this is the fact that most of the terrible anti-cheat software that pretty much any competitive online game uses just isn't compatible with Linux, which means a lot of games that I play just aren't compatible with Linux. I mean, Escape from Tarkov doesn't work. The Battlefield 6 beta didn't work on Linux, which was really sad. I was so excited about it, but I wasn't dual booting to Windows because I really wanted a pure month-long Linux experience. So I just had to sit there like a cock watching everybody else have a great time with the beta while I was stuck with Linux. And this compatibility issue was the most commonly cited reason in my community post for why people who were Linux curious didn't make the jump. And the same goes for a bunch of co-op games. If you play those with your friends, chances are half of them are just randomly not gonna work on Linux, which again sucks. Luckily, the game that I spend the most time playing, Dota 2, does work on Linux, and you can play ranked games and stuff. It doesn't have an anti-cheat issue, which is really good because that's a minimum requirement for me. However, Linux found a really fun way to screw me over while playing Dota. When playing ranked Dota games, occasionally, halfway through the game, the Ethernet drivers would just crash. And the only way to remedy this was to restart the system. Again, mid-ranked game, which is a really good way to have at least 4 people report you so that you end up in a ghoul pool which just ruins your life. This happened 3 out of the like 12 games of Dota that I played in the month, which is way too frequent a problem. Now I'm sure there are some network cards which play much better with Linux, but the network card in my motherboard is supported by Linux. Linux apparently just imbues it with the special power of leprosy. And this inconsistency is honestly more annoying to me than it just flat out not supporting stuff. When it comes to external audio, for example, it manages to be even more of a pain than Windows. I use an Audient ID14 interface for my microphone and headphones at home. I made a short about this whole ordeal, but Linux picked up the audio interface and output audio over it. However, initially there was a massive channel imbalance in the audio for some reason, which I had to manually fix by manually increasing the level on one of the channels until it kind of sounded right to me. And then the most annoying part was that Linux just didn't let me use my microphone in video games for some reason. If I used like Audacity on the desktop, it was fine, but I couldn't use my mic in games, which was really annoying. I mean, how was I supposed to beg 4 strangers for forgiveness in Dota without my microphone? And this is a well-documented issue. Linux is legendarily fickle when it comes to audio interfaces. And when it comes to my YouTube workflow, that's pretty much entirely out of the question because, well, Adobe doesn't support Linux. And don't get me wrong, I hate Adobe with the burning, fiery passion of 1,000 suns, but I have to use it till the beginning of next year. Otherwise, I have to give them like $1,000 to cancel my subscription, which makes me so angry. But still, I couldn't do any work on Linux, so I had to use Anna's wildly savage MacBook setup at home. Okay, now having said all of that, I'm sure that there are a bunch of Linux users rolling their eyes at me right now. If I had just done it properly, installed Arch Linux, and built everything up from the ground up to do what I wanted it to do, I would fix at least some of these problems. But the thing is, I'm not that kind of user. The DIY element of PC gaming that I enjoy is the hardware. Software-wise, I just want the PC to get out of my way. And I get that Windows has a bunch of annoyances, but because I've been using the operating system for 75 years, I know how to deal with all of the things in it that pisses me off. And don't get me wrong, I kind of envy people that enjoy the process of getting a blank slate of an operating system and then building it up into a thing that does exactly what they want it to do, but that is just not how I interact with software. And I'm willing to bet that a huge amount of other people also don't interact with software that way. I'm sure that if I spent a bunch of time shifting through various distros, I would have found something that would have worked better for me. And if I did more research on how to fix some of the problems that I had, it would have worked. But that's just one of the reasons why switching operating systems is so difficult. The operating system isn't the reason why you use a computer. It's just a base layer of software that facilitates the stuff that you want to use it for. And once you've become used to one of those base layers, depending on what kind of person you are, it can be an extremely frustrating process moving to a new one. I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm still stuck with Adobe. I despise Adobe, but they offer an integrated workflow which I understand how to interact with, even though it's screwed me over more times than I can count. And at this point, I am done. When my account runs out at the beginning of next year, I am never giving Adobe money again, regardless of how difficult it is to shift my workflow to a different ecosystem. Which honestly is kind of a problem with algorithms as well, things like YouTube. It's the kind of thing I kind of want to do a video on, so let me know down below if that's something that you'd be interested in. So in conclusion, Linux still isn't at a point where it handles gaming well enough that I can just use it as my gaming platform. I could dual boot both Windows and Linux, but there's not much of a point considering that most of what I do with my PC at home is game on it, so I would just never use the Linux install. However, with Linux's recent massive surge in popularity, maybe a lot of these games companies are going to become more willing to support Linux. Which brings me to the end of the video. Let me know what your experiences are with either of these operating systems down below. Subscribe to the channel on the way down there, and until the next video, thank you for watching. Bye bye.